In the summer of 1940, a British soldier was handed a weapon and told it would help save his country. He turned it over in his hands and could not quite believe what he was holding. It did not look like a gun. It looked like something a plumber had left behind. A length of steel tube, a wire stock bent into a rough shape, a magazine sticking out sideways like an afterthought, and welding marks where a craftsman would have left smooth metal. There was no polish, no walnut, no sense that anyone had cared. The man holding it had grown up believing a soldier's rifle was a thing of pride, machined by skilled hands, something you trusted with your life. This thing offended every one of those instincts. He called it a piece of junk. So did almost everyone who was handed one. They gave it cruel names: the plumber's nightmare, the Woolworth Special, the Stench Gun. They said it had been made by Marks and Spencer out of Woolworth, as if it had come off a shelf in a department store rather than out of an armory.
And for a while the men were not wrong. The thing jammed. It went off when you dropped it. Some soldiers grew so wary of it that they did something with this weapon that no soldier should ever do with a gun. Something we will come to, because it tells you everything about how dangerous and how strangely useful this little weapon was. But here is what almost none of the men sneering at it in 1940 could have known. The very things they hated about it, the cheapness, the crudeness, the look of a thing bolted together in a back room, were the exact things that would, within a few short years, make it one of the most important weapons of the entire war. Not because of what it did in the hands of the regular British Army, because of where it ended up. And where it ended up is a place no one designing it in a panic in 1940 could possibly have foreseen. To understand how a weapon this despised became this vital, you have to go back to the worst moment Britain had faced in 100 years, the moment when the country very nearly had no weapons at all. In the late spring of 1940, the British Army in France was shattered, the bulk of Britain's trained fighting strength pinned against the sea at a French port called Dunkirk. What followed was one of the most extraordinary rescues in military history. Over 10 desperate days, the Royal Navy and a ragged fleet of civilian boats carried more than 300,000 men back across the Channel to England. The country celebrated it as a deliverance, and it was one, but a rescue is not a victory. The men came home, their equipment did not. To get on to those boats, the army had abandoned almost everything it could not carry. Thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds of tanks, and among it all, 11,000 machine guns and tens of thousands of rifles, simply gone. Britain had saved its soldiers and lost its arsenal. Across the Channel, a victorious German army was gathering. Everyone expected an invasion at any moment, and the men who were supposed to defend Britain, in many cases, did not have rifles to do it with. Units drilled with broom handles. Old men stood watch with shotguns from their own homes. A modern industrial nation had been stripped of its small arms in a matter of weeks, with no time and no money to do things the old, expensive way. The obvious answer was to buy weapons from America, and Britain tried. The reason that failed is the reason this whole story exists. The American Thompson was a magnificent weapon, the gold standard of its day, but it had two fatal problems. There were not enough of them, and once America began arming itself, demand swallowed everything Britain could hope to receive. And it was a craftsman's weapon, priced like one. In those first desperate orders of 1940, a single Thompson could cost the British close to $200, paid in hard currency a nearly bankrupt Britain could barely spare. A country that needed weapons by the million could not buy them at that price from a supplier who could not deliver them anyway. So Britain faced a piece of arithmetic that looked impossible to solve. It needed an automatic weapon in numbers approaching the millions immediately, with almost no money and very few machine tools to make it with. The designers threw out every rule.
Beauty, finish, long service life, none of it mattered. Only three things did. The weapon had to stop an enemy at close range. It had to be dirt cheap, and it had to be made fast, in workshops that had never built a gun before by people who were not gunsmiths. Two men at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield sat down with exactly that brief, Major Reginald Shepherd and Harold Turpin. And the name they gave their weapon came straight from that partnership. They took the first letters of their own surnames, the S and the T, and joined them to the first letters of Enfield, the E and the N. Shepherd, Turpin, Enfield. Sten. What they designed was a kind of brilliant subtraction, a tube for the barrel, a larger tube for the body, a bolt, a spring, a trigger, a magazine. The whole thing built from stamped and pressed steel, held together with a little welding and the barest machining, with no wooden furniture and no decoration of any kind. To a soldier raised on the elegant Lee Enfield rifle, it looked like an insult. But every one of those compromises hit the impossible target dead center.
Because the Sten needed no great arms factory, it could be built almost anywhere, farmed out to small firms with no history of making weapons, assembled in stables and lofts and back rooms above shops. The most basic versions could be put together in around 5 hours of labor, and at its cheapest, the Sten cost only about £2 to make, roughly $10 American at the time. For the price of one Thompson in 1940, Britain could turn out dozens of Stens. They had built a weapon a bankrupt nation could afford to issue by the million. But the cleverest thing about the Sten was not the price. It was a single decision buried in the design that nobody much noticed at the time, and that would turn out to matter more than anything else about the gun. It is the reason this weapon ended up where it did. The designers built it to fire the 9mm cartridge, the same round used across most of Europe, and crucially, the very same round fired by the standard German submachine gun. A man who carried a Sten could feed it with captured German ammunition. The enemy's own bullets would work perfectly in your weapon. For a regular soldier, that was a convenience. For someone cut off from any supply at all, hiding, hunted, with no factory behind him, it would one day be the difference between a useful weapon and a useless lump of pipe. Remember that decision. It is going to come back, and when it does, it changes everything about who this weapon could arm.
But none of that was visible to the men holding the things in 1940 and 1941. What was visible were the flaws, and in the early days they were serious. The Sten jammed, often, especially when the gun was dirty, and worse, the early models fired from an open bolt and could go off entirely on their own if the weapon was knocked or dropped. A loaded Sten that fell to the floor might simply start firing on its own. And this brings us back to that thing soldiers did with this gun that no one should ever do with a weapon, because some men, knowing the Sten would fire on impact, turned that fault into a tactic. There are reports from the war of soldiers deliberately hurling a loaded, cocked Sten through a window or a doorway, letting it hit the floor and open up on its own, raking the room and scattering everyone inside in a panic before another man rushed in behind it. A weapon you can use by throwing it is not a feature anyone set out to design. But here is the crucial detail those nicknames hide. It was not that the Sten was a bad design, it was that some Stens were badly built, rushed out in a hurry by firms with no experience. A well-made one, kept clean, was a completely different animal, and men who carried good examples rated it more reliable than the celebrated Thompson. As the war went on, the gun got better, and by late 1942, a Sten in good condition was a thoroughly effective weapon. Consider what it did to the men carrying it. A section armed with bolt-action rifles could manage perhaps 15 aimed shots a minute each. Drop a working submachine gun into that same section, firing hundreds of rounds a minute, and their close-range firepower was transformed.
Yet for all the millions the regular armies carried, that is not where this weapon made history. The Sten's greatest chapter was written in secret in the occupied countries of Europe by people whose names were never recorded, fighting an enemy who gave them no mercy if they were caught. And here is the strange twist at the heart of the whole story. Everything the British regular had sneered at, the crudeness, the simplicity, the look of a thing from a back room, turned out to be exactly what these people needed. A resistance fighter needed a weapon small enough to hide under a coat, one that broke apart and went back together in moments, and one that fired ammunition he could steal or capture. Now remember that one buried decision, the 9mm round, the enemy's own cartridge. For a regular soldier it had been a convenience. For a man in an occupied country, cut off from every supply line, it was everything. He could raid a German ammunition store and walk away with a full load. The Sten drank the enemy's bullets. And there was one more thing the underground needed that no other serious weapon could offer. They needed guns they could not just receive, but make. And the Sten was so brutally simple that it could be copied from scratch by amateurs in secret. The Allies parachuted Stens into occupied Europe by the tens of thousands, dropping crates into fields in the dead of night. But the truly remarkable thing is what the underground did once they had even a few in their hands. They took them apart, studied them, and started building their own. In Denmark, the resistance turned out around 200 Stens in, of all places, a bicycle repair shop on a road south of Copenhagen, and more in scattered little workshops across the city, because the genius of the design was that it never demanded a real arms factory. A workshop, a few tools, and one example to copy from were enough. But it was in Poland that this reached a scale that almost defies belief. The Polish Home Army received around 11,000 Stens smuggled in by Britain's secret services, and the Poles did far more than receive them. Because the design was so simple, local production sprang up in at least 23 separate underground workshops scattered across occupied Poland, right under the noses of the German occupation. Some copied the British gun exactly. Others built their own designs on the same logic, the most famous a weapon the Poles called the błyskawica, the lightning gun, whose parts screwed together with threads instead of welds, so that even a modest workshop could put one together. More than 700 were built in secret shops across Warsaw. Together with the Polish-built Stens, they were among the only weapons mass-produced in secret anywhere in occupied Europe during the entire war.
Now picture what that meant, hour by hour, for the people doing it. In a cellar beneath a city crawling with German troops, men and women bent over workbenches assembling weapons by the light of a single bulb, knowing that discovery meant the end for them and their families. And the problem was not only how to build the guns, but how to test them, because a single gunshot in an occupied city brings the enemy running. In Warsaw, the resistance solved it in a way that is almost impossible to imagine. They built an underground firing range beneath the city, lined with layers of concrete to deaden the sound. And then they test-fired their homemade weapons during the evening rush hour, timing each shot to be swallowed by the noise of the traffic in the streets above, so that the Germans walking those very streets would never hear the guns being proved beneath their feet. Out of workshops like these came the weapons that armed the great uprisings, the moments when the occupied finally turned on their occupiers with whatever they had managed to build and hide. And what so many of them held at that decisive moment traced directly back to a despised length of steel pipe, designed in a blind panic at Enfield in 1940. The weapon the British Tommy had called the Stench Gun had become the lightning in the hands of the Polish underground. The thing judged too crude for a proud regular army turned out to be exactly crude enough to be built in a bicycle shop by people fighting for their lives. The Sten's flaws and its virtues were the same thing, seen from two different angles. The very crudeness that offended the professional soldier was what put a working automatic weapon into the hands of a farmer, a schoolteacher, a teenager who had nothing else at all.
So, when we remember the elegant guns of the Second World War, the polished rifles with their walnut stocks and their proud histories, it is worth pausing over the ugly one, the one nobody wanted, the one that jammed and went off when you dropped it and looked like it had been bolted together by a plumber. Britain built it by the million, somewhere around 4 million by the end of the war, and it never really stopped, surfacing in conflicts for decades afterward, built in backstreet workshops all over the world. Because that crude, despised 2-pound length of pipe could do something none of the beautiful ones could. It could be made by anyone anywhere, fed on the enemy's own bullets, and built in secret by people with nothing. The soldier who first held one in 1940 turned it over in disgust and called it junk. He could not have known he was holding the future, or that the thing he despised would, within a few short years, be falling out of the night sky into the hands of half of occupied Europe. They hated it because it was cheap and crude and ugly, and cheap and crude and ugly turned out to be exactly what the moment required. The Sten was never meant to be admired, it was meant to be enough, and for the men and women who had nothing else, it was everything.